Welcome back to Psychology. I'm so excited to have you in my Psychology 2 class where we're going to take the things that we learned in Psych 1 and we're going to take it to a whole new level. You're going to learn so much more about psychology. In this whole unit, we're going to be talking about personality theories, where our personality comes from, how we display different personality traits, how did they come about. And we're going to start with the simplest of our theories that we're going to be looking at, and that would be the trait theories. So today's learning target is that by the end of this lesson, you will be able to evaluate and explain the development of the trait theories of personality. Before we get into those theories, though, let's talk about what a trait is. A trait, by definition, is an aspect of personality that's considered to be reasonably stable. In other words, we see these different characteristics over time. Anything that is a characteristic of who a person is, how you would describe a person, is what we're considering a personality trait. So where does the trait theory begin? Well, it begins back around 300 BC with Hippocrates, who was a Greek physician, and you might recognize this name from the Hippocratic Oath, which is the oath that doctors take when they receive their medical degrees. He was more known for being a physician, but he did have his own ideas about where some of our personality traits came from. He believed that we have different fluids that run through our body that are produced in different organs of the body, and that in order to be psychologically healthy, we had to have all of these different fluids in balance. And if they weren't, then they displayed themselves in some sort of a temperament, or what he called humors. So you can see in this chart here the different fluids that he thought correlated to a specific humor or temperament in a person based on how much was in their system at any given time. But this is how trait theory began, was just looking at where do these different personalities come from? How do they portray themselves? Why do we have them? And Hippocrates had that first idea. Now, fast forward to probably 1940, 1950, Gordon Alport, American psychologist, who was our first trait theorist. He was the first person to really look at and try to identify every specific personality trait that could exist in any given person. So he looked through the dictionary and found every single word in the dictionary that could be translated into a personality trait. And if I'm not mistaken, he had like 22,000 different words that he found in the dictionary that he was able to say this could be a personality trait. Through some different statistical analyses and things, he narrowed that 22,000 list down to 4,500, but that's still a lot of different personality traits. One other thing that he did, in addition to identifying all of these different possible traits, is that he categorized them. He categorized them into 3 different types of traits. The first and the highest level trait is what he called a cardinal trait, a trait that dominates a person's personality. For example, in A Christmas Carol, Ebenezer Scrooge is extremely greedy, and everything that he does centers around his greed. Mother Teresa, she had what trait theorists believe had the cardinal trait of altruism, an unselfish concern for the welfare of others, and everything she did revolved around that idea of helping others and showing compassion for others, even at her own expense. So not everyone has cardinal traits according to Alport, because they are so deep-rooted and they do dominate everything that a person does. But there are some people who do have that. The rest of us, though, we all have some sort of central traits and secondary traits. Central traits are going to be those traits that pretty much everybody thinks of when they think of you. Anything that people in general would describe you as being, or describe any person as being. So there are specific observable traits in a person that we see on an everyday basis. Secondary traits are traits that might come out in different circumstances. So somebody who's usually pretty easygoing, but you push them to the limit, you might see frustration. And you might see that person actually get angry. It's not something you see on an everyday basis, and the better you get to know a person, the more likely you are to see their secondary traits. We all have them. Your family probably sees your secondary traits more than anybody else does, or your close group of friends would know those secondary traits. Gordon Alport also said that any of these traits, whatever they are never going to occur in two people in exactly the same way. So you might describe two different people as being friendly, but they're going to exhibit friendliness in different ways. So he believed that each of these different traits operates in unique ways in each individual. And I think that's important because when we're talking about all of these different traits, we don't want to be putting people in boxes and saying, oh, this person has a personality trait of friendly. That means that he is whatever. And believing that everybody exhibits it in the same way. Not necessarily. So just keep that in mind as we go through these. The next trait theorist to come on the scene was Raymond Cattell. And he's actually probably the most popular trait theorist. We still use his personality inventory today called the 16PF, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But he took Alport's narrowed down list of 4,500 traits, and he narrowed it down even more. And what he did to start with is he took any trait that was synonymous with another and he X'd it off. He just said, we're not going to have any synonyms. We're going to have all of these traits just be individual. And he came up with two different types of traits. Surface traits, which are the traits that we see on the surface, that we see on an everyday basis, the behaviors that we see, and source traits. Now, source traits are going to be the bigger traits that the surface traits are going to come from. Let me give you an example. If a person is friendly, talkative, enjoys being around groups of people, very outgoing, those are all surface traits. And then Cattell would say that each one of those surface traits comes from the source trait of what he would call extroversion. So let me explain that a little further. He developed these different source traits using a statistical technique called factor analysis, where I factor out different clusters of related items. When we're talking about Cattell, when he looked at that list of 4,500 from Alport, he took all these words that related to each other and came up with 16 different factors or different personality traits that he called source traits. So with the example I gave you on the previous slide of a person who's friendly and outgoing and talkative, those would all be the little arrows at the bottom going up into factor 1, for example, and factor 1 would be called extroversion. Now, what Cattell is most well known for is his personality inventory. An inventory is another word for a test, personality test. And he created an inventory that we still use today called the 16PF. He narrowed it down to 16 different factors. Those are listed on the left-hand side of this chart here, from warmth all the way down to tension. And what he believed is that each person falls on a continuum for each one of these factors. Now, a continuum is like a scale from left to right. So if you look at warmth, for example, there's a low score and a high score, and then there's all the space in between. Very few people are going to score all the way on the low end or the high end of any of these different scales. They're going to score somewhere in the middle. And so wherever they score in the middle is going to be where they fall on the warmth factor or the intellect factor. It's not all or nothing. It's not you're warm or not. It's how warm are you? How intellectual are you? How emotionally stable are you? And we fall on that continuum. But there are many people who think that Cattell's 16 factors is still too broad. 4,500 is too many. Now they're still saying 16 is too many. And so Robert McCrae and Paul Costa, along with many other people who don't get a lot of credit, they used factor analysis also and took Cattell's 16 factors and they narrowed it down to 5. And we call those the Big Five. And you can use one of two different acronyms. You can either use the acronym that you see here, OCEAN, O-C-E-A-N, if you look at the different traits that are there in the picture. Or you could use CANOE. You're just changing the order of the letters. So we're going to use OCEAN and look at these 5 characteristics. And these 5 you do need to memorize. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. We're still looking at a continuum. So if we're looking at openness, we're actually talking about openness to experiences and a low scorer versus a high scorer. So a person who's open is going to be more creative, imaginative, curious, original, open to trying new things. Conscientiousness is just that. It's someone who has all their I's dotted, all their T's crossed, very well organized, perfectionistic, hardworking, punctual. And again, that's on the far high end of that conscientiousness scale. Everybody's going to fall somewhere in the middle. Extroversion is that outgoing type of personality. Agreeable is how well do I get along with others, how much do I trust others, and then neuroticism. This word actually means emotional instability. So if we're high on the neurotic scale, we're more worried, anxious, temperamental, self-conscious. So this is the 5-factor model that most people work with more than the others. Now, as we evaluate these trait theories, whether it's Alport's theory or Cattell's or the Big Five, the positives for these trait theories is that it really does a nice job of looking at what characteristics a person has, and based on those characteristics, what kinds of jobs would this person be very good at? What kinds of things would the person maybe be interested in? What kinds of other people could this person work well with or not work so well with? In fact, our different dating websites use these types of inventories to help match people with someone with whom they might be compatible. On the downside, though, none of these trait theories tell us where the traits come from. They just describe what they are, but they do a great job of describing what they are. It also doesn't look at how personality can change, whether it's over time, as we get older, and how our personality can change, or how it can change in different contexts so much. The secondary traits a little bit does that, but not enough to give it a lot of credibility for really explaining all these different personality characteristics. So great job describing, not a good job explaining. So those are your pros and cons of this trait theory as we evaluate how much we really want to use it. So hopefully, as a result of this lesson, you're able to evaluate or tell the pros and cons and explain how trait theories developed over time. So until next time, make sure you jot down some questions if you have them, and I'll be sure to answer those when you come back to class. So until next time, I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in class.